At the end of last week's session, I talked about spectrophotometers and the difference between them and colorimeters. And spectrophotometers measure reflected light. So it's one of these devices that you use to calibrate a printer, to profile a printer. And that's basically what we're going to have a look at tonight, I hope. So we also talked about this really weird color space thing and kind of defined a color space just as a three-dimensional graph, really, which encompasses a wide range of all colors, giving them, I'm sure you remember all of this from last week, yes, but giving them all a numerical value so that any particular color we pick up will always have a specific value of red, a specific value of green, and a specific value of blue. And it's important to remember that for what lies ahead. So, color spaces. A color space is device independent, and what that means is that no matter what you're using a color space in or with, it remains a constant. The color values remain absolutely constant. And there are three popular spaces: sRGB, Adobe RGB 1998, and ProPhoto RGB. And I think I explained last week, but it's worth going over again. sRGB was created because basically it was adopted by everybody because it was the color space that included all the colors that a traditional CRT TV was capable of displaying. So it was great at the time because you couldn't produce brighter colors or fluorescent colors or really saturated colors because the TVs of the day simply couldn't do it. They weren't up to the job. Cameras, however, were. And so a few years on, and Adobe in 1998, what a surprise, introduced something called Adobe RGB 1998, which is a wider color space than sRGB. And if you do your own printing, and if you have, I'm sitting next to a 10 ink cartridge printer, and my 10 ink cartridge printer is perfectly capable of producing colors in the Adobe RGB 1998 range. So it makes sense for me to save images in that color space rather than sRGB. Most high street labs like Boots and stuff still insist on using sRGB. So you're a bit stuffed if you don't do your own printing. At the top end, there's a third one called ProPhoto RGB. And ProPhoto RGB more or less covers all the colors, and no matter how dark, light, saturated, unsaturated, metallic, whatever, that the human eye is capable of seeing, and doesn't have a huge amount of use in a photographer's arsenal, but it certainly has some use, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the next thing we need to talk about is Gamut. You'll note that the picture is exactly the same. So Gamut is a color space, but unlike the ones we've just been describing, it's device dependent. So in other words, your camera has a gamut, your printer has a gamut. And what happens when you when you record an image in your camera is that all of the colors that are recorded will be recorded in the printer's gamut, and then it will be mapped into whatever color space you have decided to map that into. So, as I said earlier, for most people, that's sRGB. A lot of professionals, particularly those printing at home, will use one of the bigger ones like Adobe 1998. So calibrating a printer can make the most colossal difference. And these two images side by side, same photograph, actually Phil Bruce, and he had some prints made by a friend who was, I think, a member of the Colchester Photographic Society. And then he came to me and said, I'm really not happy with these colors. Could you have a go and see if they look any different? And so these are sections of the same image, one that's been created by a properly profiled printer and one that is from a printer that clearly hasn't been. So the difference can be absolutely gigantic. Gamut terminology, people usually talk about narrow and wide color gamuts rather than large and small. Don't know why, that's just the way it's turned out. But just to give you a sense of what it means is that as far as the amount of colors are concerned, these two boxes contain exactly the same number of sticks of color. Okay, so the one on the left, which is chalk, only contains 5 colors, but it's got 24 sticks in there, I think. And then, as you can see, the wax crayon one shouts very loudly that it's a 24 pack. And the range of colors in the wax crayon box are obviously much, much wider and much, much more colorful. And depending on how hard you press, much denser than anything that you could ever create with the little box of chalk. So the little box of chalk is described as a narrow gamut, and the wax crayons become a wide gamut. So the printer next to me is a very, very wide gamut printer. So this is the process. This runs for about 5 minutes, so I'll just try and talk you through it. But this is the process for creating a profile for a printer. I think I waved pictures of these swatches last week, and it's a painstaking process because you end up with 3 sheets of paper covered in tiny, tiny little colored squares, and using this very expensive device, you just sweep it across each of the rows of colored squares. And as it goes, the spectrophotometer records the color values of each of those little color squares. It then compares, the software then compares those color values to the color values that it knows that it should be. And then it creates a lookup table, the old LUT that we talked about last week. It creates a lookup table so that every single color that is presented to the printer is tweaked slightly by the lookup table to produce the best possible color. I spent a ridiculous amount of money on this because at the time I thought lots and lots of people would queue up and say, oh, could you do that for me? Could you do that for me and my printer and my paper? Because that would be really fantastic. And it didn't work because they didn't. The software is really intelligent. It doesn't matter whether you swipe left to right or right to left, makes absolutely no difference. And nor does it matter if you skip a row because it knows which row you should be working on. So it gets a bit shouty if you make any mistakes.
For what it's worth, Mike,
Yeah.
our Xerox machine at work has a simple spectrometer with it, and every time we change the paper for a job, you print out a sheet which has a sliding, it has the 4 CMYK bars running from 0 to 100%.
Yes.
And the operator runs the spectrometer along the 4 bands, one after the other, and then the machine. It's not as advanced as that one, obviously, but the Xerox then calibrates the CMYK values on that paper. So if you're printing it on particularly,
Simon, can I interrupt you for a moment, because this is just about to finish? So,
Yep, sure.
What's happening here? I'm going for an illuminant of D65, which you'll remember is daylight, because I assume that most of my photographs will be viewed in daylight. There's a few other odd selections to make, whether you want colourful or saturated results. And once that's done, like now, you give the thing a name, and for the purposes of tonight, I think I've called this Suffolk Mug 2020 or something. One would never call a profile Suffolk Mug 2020. It needs to be named after the printer and the paper type that you're using, so that you'll always recognize what it's for, because it's completely unique to one type of paper and one particular printer with one particular type of inks. So I suppose I've got half a dozen running on my machine. So there we are, that's done. And it's produced what looks like a color space. The reason that it's revolvable and checkable is that if it's got any dents in it or any obvious damage in it, you know you need to do it again. Here we are in Photoshop. I've just hit Command P to go to print. I've set my print settings up. I need to change the color handling to Photoshop Manager's color. I then need to go and find Suffolk Mug 2020, and I hit the print button, and that will create the best possible color print that, that you can create. So the next thing we need to talk about is rendering intent. There are two types of rendering intent that photographers rely on, and it's a bit complicated. So I have a toy. My box of fluffy balls. So if you imagine that this cardboard box is the gamut for my color printer, and those are all the colors that are included in a particular image, and it's absolutely full, the rendering intent becomes important if you introduce colors that are outside the gamut of the printer. So it's full of color, there's no room for any other color, and then you introduce all of these other colors which are really vibrant. And the question is, where do they go? And basically they can't go anywhere, because they can't be included in the gamut because they won't fit. So they kind of fall off the sides. And rendering intent is all about deciding, so this is really boring and really long, but I'll talk you through it. It's about how you deal with the colors that are out of gamut. I've got notes, and this very lengthy description is in the notes, but let's stop this and have a look at some pictures. If I can remember how to get out. So this is a really geeky piece of software called ColorThink, and ColorThink is used by color professionals for checking color, checking profiles, making sure that they're behaving the way that they're supposed to be behaving. So what you're looking at the moment is the color space for sRGB, okay? And you remember you saw that big sort of wedge of color slowly rotating earlier. So this is the view from up looking straight down. And so this is a definition of the outer edges of sRGB. So you can see all the colors of the rainbow in it. If I just add the profile for Adobe RGB, you can see that down at the purple blue end, there's no difference at all. There's quite a lot of difference at the red orange edge, which is important for me in theatre because it's a colour that seems to feature rather a lot, especially at Christmas. And there's an absolutely gigantic difference at the green blue end. So what that means is, if you're doing your own printing, most especially if you're photographing stuff that's heavy on the greens and blues, it makes far more sense to use an Adobe RGB 1998 profile rather than sRGB, because it will be able to hold and maintain a much wider range of those particular tones. Just so you have an idea, so this is what ProPhoto looks like. ProPhoto is absolutely unprintable because, as I said, it's basically more or less human eyesight. And much of it lies way outside the capabilities of any printer today. So why is this important? It's important now because if I overlay the profile that we've just created, as you can see here, the Suffolk Mug 2020 profile, that's where it sits. So just to make this a bit simpler, I'm going to turn off ProPhoto and I'm going to turn off Adobe RGB 1998. And if you compare these two, you can see that the printer can't print anything approaching those deep purples and vibrant blues that sRGB contains. You can see here that the printer is capable of creating a much, much deeper and stronger and more vibrant oranges and yellows around here. And it's also capable of producing a lot more of these blue cyan greens than is contained within the sRG color space. So if we applied the sRGB color space to this image, when we drop it out of Photoshop into something, into a printable file, all of this stuff will be lost. All of this stuff will be lost because it will all be shrunk down to fit within the confines of the sRGB color space. So let's have a look at Adobe RGB 1998. So, and I'll turn sRGB off. So this is really interesting. So in the Adobe RGB 1998 color space, most of what is printable is actually safely included. There's a tiny bit of bluey cyan stuff here, but nothing worth worrying about. But this is a concern because, especially for me at Christmas and a typical pantomime, the colors you see most are these colors, yellows, oranges, and reds. And my printer can actually print quite a lot of really, really, really vivid tones that are not included in this profile. But I know that most of the colors are included in it. So when I'm printing stuff for the Wolsey, for example, at Christmas, and I know that there's a lot of those kind of colors, all of this stuff at this end, I'll quite often apply a ProPhoto RGB profile simply because it will give me the best, brightest, most vivid reds and yellows and the sort of colors that you associate with pantomime.
Why do you not do it all the time? Is there a cost to doing it?
Yes, there is, because so if there's a whole pile of color that is outside the gamut of my printer, that is anything except orange yellow, you might get unexpected results. Because if, let's just say, for example, let's just say that which is actually Adobe RGB 1998, but let's just say that those are the colors that a particular print has in them. We know that our printer can only print stuff within this boundary. So what the hell happens to all of this and what the hell happens to all of this? Does that make sense, Phil?
Yeah. What does happen to it?
So, well, I'll show you. Next, I think. This is a terrifying demo because it involves so many different bits of software. Let me just minimize that for a moment. Open Photoshop. So here's a ridiculously saturated image, okay? And I've purposely saved this ridiculously saturated image in full ProPhoto RGB. Now, my monitor isn't capable of displaying many of the colors, and the difficulty is knowing which ones you know, which color space to use, because if the monitor, you know, and this is it's only a 1-year-old MacBook Pro, but even with my very expensive desktop monitor, it cannot display colors outside of Adobe RGB 1998. So Photoshop, and I'm using Photoshop only because all of the other photo editing software has these facilities, offers these facilities. I'm using Photoshop because it's the one, obviously, that I'm most at home at. But up in the View menu, it has proof set up. Here we are. And what proof setup will do is it will simulate the results that you'll get with any particular printer. Okay, so if you've got a printer profile, and of course we've just made our Suffolk Mug 2020 profile somewhere. There it is. So I'm going to apply that. And there's a preview button here. So that is what is going to be printed. Does that make sense? It's much yellower. And the reason is it's forcing all the colors into the Suffolk Mug 2020 ICC profile, and they're all changing a bit. There's a wonderful option here that actually shows you which colors are actually out of gamut, depicted by the green. And as you can see, there's hardly anything in this image that isn't out of gamut. So let's go back. So what we need to talk about next really is rendering intent. I mentioned earlier.
Mike.
Yes.
Mike, while you're in there, I think perhaps it would help if as well as your Suffolk mug, if you chose something like, you know, US swap, perhaps that would, and then you would see the difference, because that would give you roughly what a printing press can print out compared to your 10 color printer, right? If you swap between, like, say that and the Suffolk mug,
actually it doesn't look very, genuinely, Simon, it doesn't look very different, does it?
No, the gamut won't look any different because it's all out. But if you turn off your gamut warning,
okay,
because it's all going to be out of gamut. But if you turn that off,
bring preview in again, Mike, on the window as well.
Yeah, right. So if you preview that,
okay. So there's working CMYK.
So that's roughly what you'd get if you printed it, you know, in an ordinary printing press. And if you swap that then back to Suffolk Mug, you'll see how much more vibrant the Suffolk Mug is, because your printer is so much more, you know,
it's a huge
wide gamut.
Huge difference. But let me just talk now about rendering intent before I let you go and head off for your gins and tonics. So there's a rendering intent drop-down menu here. Only two of these are relevant to photographers. One is perceptual and one is relative colorimetric. So let me just go into a different program. Right, so there's our Suffolk Mug ICC profile. So I'm just going to reduce the opacity down quite a long way, and then drag this image into it. So as I very slow, I'll try and do this very slowly, but as I move this around, you can see that there's a great swathe of yellow dots outside the gamut of the printer, which means that they are not presently printable. And I think the same goes for both the red channel, if I can find it. There it is. Again, there's a great lump of stuff sitting on the outside. And then there's also a great lump of stuff in the blue channel that's sitting outside. And rendering intent is a description of what you do about these little devils that are not sitting, that are basically not printable. So perceptual means that it'll find the furthest out point, drag it until it meets the surface of the ICC profile. So in other words, that furthest out point will be as bright as the ICC profile is capable of making it. But then all of this stuff behind it will all move in relation to that furthest point. So a point here will end up back here somewhere, and a point that's actually inside, already inside the ICC profile space, will also be shunted backwards towards the center, and in other words, it will lose its saturation. So what that means is that you can end up with desaturating your images if you're not careful, because you're not just moving this stuff back, you're moving everything back, because every single one of these pixels will move back in relation to that furthest point.
And that's perceptual, you said.
That's perceptual. So the furthest point will move to meet until it meets the profile, and then everything else will move in relation to it. So everything will become less saturated in order to accommodate the furthest point. If you use relative colorimetric, it takes absolutely everything that's outside the gamut, outside the Suffolk Mug 220 ICC profile, and slaps it around the edge. So in other words, all of this material here, absolutely every single pixel of it, will become the same color as the brightest bright that the profile is capable of creating. So in general, if there's tons outside the gamut, go with perceptual. But if there's only odd little bits, like for example, if the only problem here were perhaps those few red ones, there's not much there. But if that was the only problem, then use relative colorimetric. And the reason for that is that if you take these yellows as the worst example, if you shift all of those pixels and make them that color, you stand a very good chance of introducing banding in your photograph. So, because you'll have a great wodge of color that's absolutely the same, and it doesn't look good. So as a general rule, I guess as a general rule, it's safest to go with perceptual, because without this software, it's extremely difficult to know exactly what is and what isn't within the boundary of the gamut.
Mike,
sorry?
Mike, John, what you just explained is the first time I've ever understood that, because all the textbooks, and some of them quite complicated, they gloss over it. They just say perceptual and live happily ever after. You know, it's that sort of thing. So thank you very much for that.
Not at all. And the reason this is really, really important for me in theatre, because very often, and again, I always go back to it, but especially at holiday time, especially at Christmas, when, you know, Panto is all about bright, vibrant colours. You know, you want your pictures when they appear in the press to look absolutely as dazzling as possible, and the prints that go front of house as well. You want them to look as bright sunglass inducing
So Mike,
brightness.
can I just ask then?
Yeah.
You say we haven't got access to this software normally to see what you've just
No,
shown
but
us. But could we not make a choice by looking at one and then looking at the other and comparing them?
Yes.
In a sort of soft proofing? Because isn't this stuff that you've just been showing us, isn't that the same as soft proofing?
It is, except, but there's a big proviso there, and that's because unless you've got a very expensive full Adobe RGB 1998 printer, anything that's outside the gamut of that printer is undisplayable. So does that make sense? So you might not actually be able to see the difference because of the limitations of the monitor. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. I mean, there's no such.
You mean the printer itself could see a difference and make a difference?
Yes.
So you would get two different prints, but you can't see that on the monitor, even in soft.
Absolutely, 100% correct. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
You're using an iMac, aren't you? And I think the iMac these days. I think the iMac has a gamut. Simon, correct me. Is it called P3? I think it is. I think it was adopted for video, and I think it's somewhat better than sRGB.
I'm not sure what it's called, but yes, the latest Macs have what they call the wider true tone color, I believe.
Yeah, which is not. It's not great. It's great use of videographers because apparently that's. I know nothing about video, but Chris, are you there? You probably know this. But as I understand it, P3 is like the standard color space for video. So they've adopted that. But P3 is better than sRGB, but it's not as good as Adobe RGB 1998. So you end up in this pickle because you don't know what colors really that your printer's seeing and which ones they're not. What you can do is...
Mike, just before you leave that, you again made the statement that you want your prints to look, absolutely fabulous in the foyer of the Wolsey. Yeah. I understand that. And then as a throwaway, you say, and in the press. But the press are going to screw them up, aren't they? Again?
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. That's nonsense. And that's me.
Yeah, right.
What's
talking out of somewhere else.
The Joss Whedon line, Mike, your mouth is talking. You might want to look to that. Yeah, no, that's not true. That's not true. The press has to be sRGB. I was just about to open Photoshop because I think, I'm not sure. Let me just try this. I believe, no, it's grayed out. Now that's weird. Ah, okay, we're in business. We're in business. Okay, so I'm in Photoshop. I've just pressed Command P to go to the print box. I've set it up for my Epson Stylus Pro 4900, which is my big printer. I'm not going into print settings. We'll just assume that they're all correct. I've set color handling to Photoshop because that's what we want. And I've chosen the profile. And now what was previously grayed out, and I'm afraid I don't know if this is the same in Affinity Photo, but I'll have a look before we start the Affinity Photo course. Here we've got a little gamut warning box, and I think, there you go. So it's doing exactly the same thing from within the print dialog box. So I know that when I print this, the results might not be what I expect.